Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem to get on Daf Kuf Beis, Amud Beis at the very top. Our parak deviates now from the Malach of Hoitzah and now discusses additional malachos, specifically now opening up with Meleches Boine, building. Haboine Kama Yivne V'Yechayev. The Mishnah begins by asking, how much building does one have to do to transgress the malacha and be chayev for korban chatos? Answers the Mishnah, haboine kolshu. Even a minimal amount is considered to be enough to hold somebody liable for building on Shabbos. V'hamesates, and one who chisels stone. V'hamamake bepatish v'ma'atzad. If a person wants to dislodge a stone from, let's say, a mountain, so they cut around the stone, and the last final blow is the make bepatish. So it says over here that that's the classical example of make bepatish, a malacha d'oraisa of one of 39 malachos, and a tolda of that malacha would be any gemar malacha is then attributed to make bepatish, either done with a patish or a matzad. Over here is what the Mishnah is referring to. A matzad is either a sledgehammer. HaKodeach, one who drills, all of these things, chiseling a stone, or the makeh patish that we just described, either with a patish or a matzad, or Kodeach drilling, the shear is kolshu chayev, the minimum amount. The Mishnah brings a principle, zeh haklau, kol ha'oiseh malacha, u'malachta miskayemes b'Shabbos chayev. Anybody does who a malacha on Shabbos, and it has kiyum, that malacha is going to then be chayiv. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel oimer afa make bekurnos ala sadon b'shas malacha chayiv. He says that even when a person is using a hammer, and let's say it's a coppersmith, and he's using a hammer, he needs to then sometimes hit an anvil. He'll hit with the hammer on the plate of metal, and then he hits the anvil so that the hammer doesn't get pointed. It remains smooth, so it doesn't ruin the sheet of metal that he's working with. So therefore, he is mechadesh now, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, that one who hits the sadon will also then be chayiv b'shas the malacha. That will be a chiyuv of make b'patish. B'pnei shehu mimasakein malacha, because he's mimasakein the malacha, he's then fixing up the patish as he's going ahead and doing this malacha. The Gemara now asks the following question: Kol shehu lemay chazia. What is a koshu of binyan going to be fitting to chayiv a person from meleches boine? Omrav Yirmiyahu shekein ani choifer gumo lahatzniya ba prutoisov. Rabbi Yirmiyahu explains that an ani would dig a small hole in the ground to hide his coins. The Gemara goes on to say, "The kavose gabi mishkan shekein toifer yirios choifen gumo lahatzniya bo machtein." Also, those who would sew the curtains of the Mishkan, they also then hid their needles in the ground. So they would dig a small hole to hide their needles in the ground. Now, here the Gemara finds it necessary to bring a precedent from the Mishkan. Whereas we find in other cases when it talks about a kol shehu, let's say, for example, the Mishnah says that if a person takes out a palpeles, he takes out this, which is even a kol shehu, he'll be chayiv from meleches hoitzah. There, the Gemara doesn't explain what is the precedent in the Mishnah. It just says what is it going to then be used for, which the Gemara explains is used for a breath mint. So even a kol shehu will be chayiv. Here, the Gemara finds it necessary to give us a present from the Mishkan. Why? The answer is because here binyan doesn't have any chashivus if it's just a kol shehu, unless we find a precedent in the Mishkan, whereby then a person will be held liable for making a kol shehu of binyan on Shabbos. The Gemara says, "Vayter Abaye Omar." Abaye now explains, since Kivan de Mishtechi loy avdi haki. Abaye challenges this last perush of Rabbi Yirmiyahu and says it can't be that in the Mishkan those who were sew the curtains would hide their needles in the ground. He said because that would cause the needles to become rusted. So that can't be the pshat. Rather, he says, Elo shekain ani oise pitpute kiro kitana, lishbois ale kideiro kitana. Rather, we're talking about an ani who would make a small tripod, so they can set on that tripod a small stove. The kavose gabi mishkan, we find something similar in the Mishkan. Mivashle tzamonin litzboye riyos shechosem olachton oisim pitpute keiro kitana lishbois ale yora kitana. That we find in the Mishkan those who would then cook the herbs in order to then use them for their dye. So they would make a small tripod to then set the pot of herbs to then cook on this fire. Ask the Gemara, Pitpute Rav Acha bar Yaakov Omar Ein Aniyos b'Mokom Ashiros. He says that it can't be that you'll have a situation where there's not enough dye in some of the yerios, that they'd have to set up a small pot in order to then re-dye and fill in the lack of dye in certain yerios. That wouldn't be fitting in the Mishkan. And therefore, that can't be what the usage was in the Mishkan. Rather, Ella shekain b'halabayis sheyesh lo nekev bebirosa v'soitmoy. Rather, we must be talking about where a balabayis who has a home that he wants to take care of it well. It's a nice home, and he gets a hole in the wall, so he fills it up with a little lead. The kavose gabi mishkan shekain keresh shenofle bordarna matif. Still, similarly, we find in the Mishkan, when one of the Keroshim, one of the boards, had got a hole from a worm in it, so they would then fill it up with some lead, and therefore that would be considered to be a form of binyan, a kol shehu. So we found our precedent. The Gemara now says, Omar Shmuel, hametzadeid es ha'even chayev. One who puts an eved down on the ground as a cornerstone will be chayiv. Meisvei asked the Gemara from the following brayso: Echad noisin es ha'even, ve'echad noisin es hatit. Ha'noisin es hatit chayiv. If one person places down a stone, then somebody else comes along and puts the tit. The one who puts the tit is going to be chayiv. So we see putting down a stone alone is not chayiv. Answers the Gemara, Tameich ema seifa. According to your reasoning, you have to look at the seifa of this brayso. Rabbi Yossi Omer va'afilu hele ve'niach al gabe dimu shel avonim chayiv. Even a person just places a stone on top of a row of stones, that itself will be chayiv. So you see that it's not in line with what you're saying, that it has to be that you put the tit on. Answers the Gemara to explain. Ela tlasa binyane havu. There are three different components of building. Tata, Mitzia, V'iloi, the bottom, the middle, and the top. Tata boy to do the va'ofra. The bottom merely needs placing a stone, like as a counterstone, with some ofar, just to make sure that it's then in its place. So that's supported. Mitzia boy namitina. But the middle needs tit, in order to then stay connected to the bottom and the top parts of this layers of stone. Eloi bahanocha ba'ama, whereas the top layer, it's enough just to place the stone alone. And therefore, that's what he meant before when he said that a person who merely then is going mitzaded es ha'even, he's going to be chayiv. That's because he's putting the stone as a cornerstone with some ofar. And that which it says in the brayso, that the one who places the tit is going to be chayiv, that is talking about the middle. Whereas there's another layer, where if a person puts the top layer and just merely places the stone alone, then he's going to be chayiv for that section of Malacha Binyan. Says the Gemara, quoting our Mishnah, our Mishnah says a person who chisels a stone will be held accountable, liable for chatos on Shabbos. The Gemara now wants to know, for what malacha is this? It's machloikes, mesates mishumat mechayev. Why is he chayev for chiseling a stone? Rav amar mishum boina. Rav says it's preparing for building, because you're going to then make it a square stone to be able to put into a building, or you're going to smooth it out, and therefore he's chayav for binyan, for boina. V'shmuel amar mishum make bepatish. Shmuel says no, this itself is now considered to be a finishing touch on the stone, and therefore it's chayav for make bepatish on its own. The Gemara now brings two additional cases. A person puts a hole in a chicken coop. Rav amar mishum boine, Ushmuel amar mishum makeh bepatish. Rav still says over here consistently that this would be boine by making this hole in the chicken coop, whereas Shmuel remains consistent by saying this is makeh bepatish. A third scenario where both say the same shita, ayo shufto bekofino demaro, where a person puts a peg in a hole of a hoe, of a blade. He then Rav amar mishum boina, he's chai for boina, and Shmuel amar mishum makeh bepatish. So we have three scenarios where all three scenarios Rav says is going to be chai for boina, and Shmuel says chai for makeh bepatish. Says the Gemara v'tzricha, and we need all three. If we only had the first case of chiseling the stone, then I would say be'ahi ka'omar Rav mishum the derech binyan bekach. Then that's where Rav says that he's going to be chayiv because that's a way of building by then preparing these stones by putting into the building. Aval oise nekev b'lushal tarnegolim de'ein derech binyan bekach ema moidel l'shmuel. But when it comes to a lul shel tarnegolim, which is only then producing so that there'll be some ventilation, that is not derech binyan bekach, and therefore he would be moide perhaps to Shmuel. If I only heard the case of the lul shatar negolim, we're making a hole into this chicken coop, mishum de dami lebinyan, da avde la aviro. Then Rav would say that it's still doime to binyan, that would be chayiv because it still is like a window. You have not only for ventilation, but also you have for to go wind to go out, or air to go out rather, and air to come in, similar to a window or a door. So therefore, it is also dami lebinyan. Aval shufta bekufina demaro, but by placing a peg into the hole of a hoe, de'ein derech binyan bekach ema moidel l'shmuel. Since that's not the way of building, therefore he would agree with Shmuel. So therefore, we need all three cases to say that Rav would hold in all three cases they're chayav for boine, and Shmuel would argue and say chayav for all three cases for makeh bepatish. Oh, I'm sorry, one more scenario. And if I only had the latter case of putting a peg inside the hole of a hoe, that's where Shmuel says makeh bepatish. But in the first two scenarios of making a hole in the chicken coop and also chiseling the stone, maybe I would say Shmuel would agree with Rav, that would be boine, tzricha. And therefore we need all three scenarios again that shows that Rav would hold chayiv for boine and Shmuel would say chayiv for makeh bepatish. Says Gemara Vayter boy mine Rav Nosin bar Oshia me Rabbi Yochanan. They asked Rabbi Yochanan the following question: Mesates mishum mai mechayiv. On this question that we said Rav and Shmuel are arguing, chiseling a stone, what do you, Rabbi Yochanan, hold? Are you chayiv for boine or chayiv for makeh bepatish? Achrile biode mishum makeh bepatish. He indicated with his hand like this, showing that it's makeh bepatish, and therefore he agrees with indeed Shmuel's opinion. The Gemara asks on this, va'anan tnan hamesates v'hamakeh bepatish, which is mashma that it's two different malachos. There's one malacha mesates, which is a different malacha than makeh bepatish. Answers the Gemara to defend Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, ema hamesates ha makeh bepatish. Without the vav, put them together and say hamesates is makeh bepatish. Toshma, the Gemara brings the following: hakodeach kolshu chayiv. If a person drills a kolshu, the Mishnah says is chayiv. Says the Gemara bishlama l'Rav. Then according to Rav, mechse keman dechad churto lebinyana. For Rav, it's very good who says that you're chayiv for the malcha of boine, because when you make a hole, you ultimately then put something, after you drill, you put something inside that hole. So therefore the drilling implies a malacha of boine. Whereas according to Shmuel, who says that it's makeh bepatish, this is very difficult, because when you drill a hole in it, that's only temporary. You're going to fill it in with something else. So how's that makeh bepatish? El l'Shmuel lav gemar malacha. Is this a gemar malacha? Certainly it's not a gemar malacha. Hachab Mayaskinan, Shmuel explains that which is in the Brisa is chayiv for kodea kolshu is because it is makeh bepatish. The bezoi ba'aramtza de parzilo V'shavki begave. He explains that we're talking about when you're drilling a long nail and you're leaving it inside the wall to be then a hanger, to hang something up on it. Therefore, when you drill in and you leave it inside, indeed it's a gemar malacha, and therefore it's makeh bepatish. Dahainu gemar malacha, and therefore Shmuel is able to defend himself from this kasha and say this is indeed also a gemar malacha of makeh bepatish.